The first thing Rowan Mercer noticed wasn't the suitcase. It was the way the young woman stood at the edge of the long driveway without moving, as if she couldn't decide whether to walk away or turn back toward the house that had just rejected her. The afternoon sun was warm, cars rolled quietly through the upscale neighborhood, and gardeners trimmed perfect hedges only a few doors away. Life looked normal. Nothing about the girl standing there felt normal. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Tallis 2.0. 28-year-old Ivy Calloway had lived in that white colonial house for almost 9 years. It had never really felt like home, but until that afternoon, she had always believed she at least had a place there. She was wrong. Her father, Warren, had married Celeste only 18 months after Ivy lost her mother to cancer. At first Celeste seemed polite enough. She brought expensive flowers to family dinners, remembered birthdays, and smiled easily whenever guests visited. Behind closed doors, she was different. Not cruel in obvious ways. Just patient. Patient enough to make Ivy feel like an unwanted guest in her own life. After Warren suffered a stroke the previous winter, everything changed. Recovery was slow, and he moved into a long-term rehabilitation center outside the city. Celeste quietly took control of the household, the finances, and every decision connected to the family. She also decided Ivy no longer belonged. That morning had started with an argument over something as small as a utility bill. Ivy had been working 2 jobs, weekday mornings at a veterinary clinic and weekend shifts at a neighborhood bakery, to save enough money for her own apartment. She paid her share every month. But Celeste didn't care. "I think it's time you figured life out somewhere else," she'd said calmly while setting down her coffee cup. Ivy had stared at her. "You can't be serious." "I am. My father would never." "Your father isn't here." The words landed harder than any shout. An hour later, Ivy's suitcase was sitting outside. Her spare key no longer worked. No one in the neighborhood opened a curtain. People rarely did. They assumed every large house held a happy family. Across the street, Rowan Mercer sat on a worn wooden bench beside the bus stop. Most people only saw his faded jacket, scruffy beard, and weathered backpack. Few noticed the paperback novel tucked beside him, or the careful way he folded empty coffee cups before placing them in the recycling bin. Rowan had been homeless for almost 11 months. Not because he wanted to be. 5 years earlier he had worked maintenance for a public school district until repeated back injuries ended his job. Medical bills piled up. His apartment disappeared. Then his aging mother became sick, and what little savings remained vanished paying for her care before she passed away. Sometimes life didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it quietly unraveled. He watched Ivy wipe her eyes before lifting the heavy suitcase. It tipped sideways. One wheel snapped off. She sighed without saying a word. Rowan stood. "You want a hand?" She hesitated. Every warning she'd ever heard about strangers flashed through her mind. Then she looked at the broken suitcase. "Please." He lifted it carefully. "The bus station." She nodded. "I think so." "You think?" "I don't really have anywhere else." He didn't ask another question. They walked slowly toward the nearest stop. Neither spoke much. The silence wasn't awkward. It was tired. At the station, Ivy counted the cash inside her wallet. $43. Not enough for a motel. Barely enough for groceries. She laughed softly at the situation. Not because it was funny. Because crying again felt exhausting. Rowan disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he carried 2 paper cups. "I traded some bottles this morning." "You didn't have to." "I know." She accepted the coffee anyway. It tasted better than she expected. For the first time all day, someone had offered her something without asking for anything back. As evening approached, the downtown shelter announced every bed had already been filled. Ivy looked defeated. Rowan scratched his beard thoughtfully. I know an old church that lets people stay on the covered porch when it rains. It'll rain tonight. Forecast says yes. She smiled weakly. I never imagined this would be my day. Neither did I, Rowan replied. They walked another mile together. The church caretaker, Mrs. Dunlap, recognized Rowan immediately. You staying here again? Only if that's all right. She noticed Ivy standing quietly behind him. Friend. Someone who needed help. Mrs. Dunlap unlocked the side entrance instead. The community room's empty tonight. She handed them blankets. No sleeping outside. That simple kindness almost broke Ivy's composure. The next morning smelled like fresh rain and wet grass. Mrs. Dunlap served oatmeal before volunteers arrived. One volunteer happened to mention a small apartment building across town looking for an overnight building manager in exchange for reduced rent. Ivy wrote down the address. The interview wasn't until afternoon. That left hours to wait. Rowan suggested visiting the public library. They don't mind if people stay a while. Inside, Ivy updated her resume while Rowan quietly read newspapers. She noticed something unusual. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't hiding. He was reading articles about city council meetings, construction permits, and local events. You actually enjoy reading those? They help me know where temporary work might show up. She had never considered that. By afternoon, Ivy interviewed with the apartment owner, a retired electrician named Gus Harlan. He liked her honesty. Especially when she admitted she was between homes. He offered her the position starting Monday. The apartment wasn't fancy. Tiny kitchen. Old carpet. Windows that stuck halfway open. To Ivy, it looked wonderful. She thanked Rowan repeatedly. He shrugged. You did the hard part. I wouldn't have made it here. You would have. I don't think so. He smiled but said nothing. Over the next several weeks, Ivy settled into her new routine. Morning veterinary shifts. Evening building inspections. Weekends at the bakery. She stayed busy enough to avoid thinking about the mansion she'd left behind. Still, one question lingered. Where was Rowan? Every Thursday she brought sandwiches to the church hoping to find him. Sometimes he was there. Sometimes he wasn't. Eventually she learned he often spent mornings helping at a neighborhood food pantry, repairing broken shelves, fixing leaking faucets, and assembling donated furniture. No one paid him. He simply liked staying useful. One rainy afternoon, Ivy arrived carrying 2 bags of groceries. She found Rowan replacing loose hinges on an old storage cabinet. You keep fixing everyone else's problems. He chuckled. Easier than fixing my own. She handed him one grocery bag. For you. I can't. You can. He reluctantly accepted. Inside sat fresh fruit, soup, clean socks, and a pair of sturdy work gloves. He stared at the gloves for several seconds. No one's bought me new gloves in years. A few days later, Gus mentioned needing someone reliable for maintenance across 3 apartment buildings. 40 hours every week. Benefits included. Without hesitation, Ivy recommended Rowan. Gus agreed to meet him. The interview lasted barely 20 minutes. Mostly because Rowan already knew how to repair almost everything Gus pointed toward. 2 weeks later he signed employment papers. 3 months after that he moved into a modest studio apartment only 6 blocks from Ivy. Neither pretended life had suddenly become perfect. Money remained tight. Old injuries still hurt. Some nights Rowan still woke from anxious dreams about losing everything again. Healing wasn't instant. It never is. Late that autumn, Warren finally returned home after rehabilitation. He learned what had happened almost immediately. He sat quietly through Ivy's explanation. Then he looked toward Celeste. "You threw my daughter out." Celeste tried explaining. Claimed Ivy needed independence. Claimed she had misunderstood. Warren simply shook his head. "I trusted you with my family." That conversation ended their marriage within the year. Not because of one argument. Because trust, once broken that deeply, rarely repairs itself. Months later, Warren visited Ivy's apartment. He looked around the small living room with mismatched furniture and second-hand curtains. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I should have seen what was happening." She nodded. "I know." He met Rowan afterward over coffee. There was no awkwardness. Only gratitude. "You looked after my daughter when I couldn't." Rowan smiled. "She looked after me too." That was the truth neither of them could deny. Kindness had traveled both directions. One winter evening nearly a year after Ivy left the mansion, she organized a neighborhood donation drive for the church shelter where everything had begun. Residents brought blankets, coats, canned food, heaters, books, and winter boots. Some recognized Rowan from before. This time they greeted him by name. Not because he had suddenly become important. Because someone had finally introduced them. Sometimes dignity begins with something as simple as being seen. As volunteers stacked donated supplies inside the community room, Mrs. Dunlap smiled at Ivy. "You remember the first night you came here?" "I do." "You looked completely lost." "I was." She glanced across the room where Rowan laughed with a group of children while teaching them how to repair a broken bicycle chain. Funny how one difficult afternoon could lead people toward entirely different lives. Not better because of suffering. Better because someone chose compassion instead of looking away. Comment: kindness still exists, if you believe even one good act can change someone's life. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. The biggest turning points in life rarely arrive with applause or dramatic speeches. More often, they begin with an ordinary person carrying a stranger's broken suitcase, offering a warm cup of coffee, or simply refusing to walk past someone who needs help. Kindness doesn't erase pain overnight, but it reminds people they don't have to face it alone, and sometimes, that's where a new beginning quietly starts.